thank the Institute for inviting me to give honor to the occasion and to the travails of these history makers over the journey of time. It's an honor to know them and to have been associated with them. Over years, I had the privilege as a young man of knowing some of them when they were in school, because I just graduated from college. And I knew many of their parents because I worked with Desegregation to help further the so-called opportunities that they had at Central High School. And I watched as they grew and as they moved from Little Rock in order to become full citizens and full human beings. I was asked to talk about the violence of the situation in 1962 and see how that relates to the present. Thetford wanted me to address the evolution of desegregation in Little Rock, at least for some of those of you who believe that it has been a constant path. I want you to know that in 1957, there were 17, not 9, students selected to enroll in Central. Only 9 showed. Hardly any of the people selected, however, were the plaintiffs in the case. They were the persons chosen by the board because they had the qualities sufficient to be accepted by a different society. And what we learned there, first of all, is that when you start trying to pick black people, we find that we're basically all the same. You can't find that some happen to be better than or more worthy than others, because people are people. So that was the first lesson that we learned. And when they went there, they were courageous. But you all should know that they were selected because they were presumed to be docile. They wouldn't rock the boat. And they would stay to themselves. Well, they didn't understand black people, and they certainly didn't understand these. When one decided that she wasn't going to be docile, just simply defending herself, they removed her from the circumstance. Made her leave town in order to get an education. And then left the others there with that message. Now understand what happened there. It was violence on the outside, violence on the inside. The violence that I observed was a lot more than physical violence. It was a violence of harming the spirit, not only of those 9, but of a world filled with people of color. So they were sending messages to all of us that only a few of us count, and they're going to determine which ones, and then over time they'll parcel benefits out to others. And that brings me to Ms. Expert's question. Desegregation did not come to Little Rock, Arkansas in any substantial degree until 1970. That was after the marches that had been generated by the Little Rock 9 and other acts had taken place. And I want to talk about that because we celebrate Little Rock 9 for what they did there. But it's really got to be put into a greater context. What they did at that time, it was 1957, they in effect caused a reluctant president of the United States who had no commitment to equity or desegregation or integration to have to stand with them in order to honor the Constitution. He did not put the moral force of his office behind them. And he left them there, basically to dangle. 1957, what happened was, other students saw what was happening here. If these students had been left alone, we would not have had a Little Rock. And I suggest to you that we would not have had the sit-ins either, not quite so soon, because they generated, by their demonstration of courage and their inclusion into a hostile environment, they in effect said that now is the time to change. So we're going to not only use the occasion of the Supreme Court decision and what they are encountering now, we're going to get other rights that belong to us. That's why they sat. And that's why they encouraged adults in the community, white and black, to stand with them. Without Central, there wouldn't have been the marches. I submit to you, without Central, the other things that happened with Dr. King and the others would not have happened so fast. Remember, in just 3 short years, as we look back historically, what we had was a president honoring, or at least seeming to honor, the movement and indicating that he would stand with black people who were seeking to overcome the shackles. Then, several years later, we had that president being assassinated, only in part because, primarily because, he stood for the Constitution and the support of Martin Luther King and the students, including these now. So that's a violent act that relates back to the entry of these students into Central High School. And with that came other things, because once you let the examples of hurt and harm and exclusion show their ugly heads, and you show how irrational it is, then other kinds of things come into play. And at that time, we saw that we had another president to follow the deceased president who had never really been in favor of civil rights. But that person, in effect, recognized that these same people, generated by the man, they were seeking their rights to vote. Because remember, we couldn't vote back then throughout most of the South, and in Little Rock, Arkansas, until the 60s, or late 50s, we had to pay a poll tax in order to vote. So this inclusion of students generated a whole series of events, including new laws, new attitudes, and more important than anything else, it sort of showed that black and white people can get along, even when they're talking about changing the status quo. That meant that they stood against violence, and the violence was perpetrated upon both blacks and whites. It was not only physical, but the physical violence is what called the imagination of the nation. And it caused other people to become aware of humanity and inhumanity. And when I started thinking about those times and the intervening years, we had a few good years during the King years and for a few years thereafter. Then comes Richard Nixon. Nixon then says that we don't have to have all of this civil rights stuff. We don't need to have integrated schools. We can have semi-integrated schools, and those kids and those people who are worthy, they can go to school together. That was the beginning of the movement to segregate people on the basis of income. It had always been there generally, but this is the way when it became overt. And that was in 1972, and you can trace it. And from that point, we had a Republican president who in effect said that we're going to divide people. Dividing people who are together is a form of violence. It is a form of oppression. It is a form of separation. And the objective is to stop the progress that is in force, that is underway. And that's what took place for a while, because here you had a president saying to a population of people, all of you can be capitalists. And we knew that wasn't the case. But some became capitalists, and then they began to try to separate us. I fast forward to now. We are facing the same problems in Little Rock, Arkansas. What we have are the beneficiaries of that separation talking about public school privatization. Well, what is the benefit of privatization? Privatization is set up to, in effect, benefit those who are already benefited, and to, in effect, be another form of slavery and segregation to those who must be submitted into a system that is profiteering, one for profit. So what you have here are students being herded into classes, being taught a little, and then being told that they're just as good as somebody else, when they know that's not the case. This whole thing has been about equality. It has been about whether or not black people are equal. There's no determination on those who would charterize our schools and take away our ability, once we have once we've used it to get the vote, take away our ability, people of goodwill, to set their own agenda for the benefit of their children. So when we see what is happening, we see the pendulum swinging. Then we knew in the 50s what it was, and we saw a little bit of hope. And now we have a new president who happens, by the way, to be Republican. And he sees people of brown and black color in the same way that President Eisenhower and President Nixon did. And he has pretty much the same agenda. Back then, they said some of those people who were dealing with Elizabeth at the bench, some of those are good people. Those are good people there. They're rating her, arraigning her. Well, what was good about them? Other than that they were white. That they had no humanity. And the same thing in Charlottesville. What was good about them? They had no humanity. But they were white. But they were going along with an agenda that basically said that black people are not equal, black people are inferior. So where we've come now forward, and we've seen different kinds of inclusion, which has resulted in different kinds of separation. And those things all have a genesis in color. As we look at the Little Rock schools, we see that the schools have been resegregated. 1970, they were segregated, two-way busing. They were desegregated for a short time. There was two-way busing. Schools were fairly equal, at least for a while. I'm not saying that they were ever equal, don't misunderstand me. But they were more equal, and people at that point learned how to get along with each other. You had social interaction across racial and economic lines, and people became friends. They learned that the allegations of difference were false. And for 15 to 20 years, we had a decent community, not only in Little Rock, Arkansas, but across the nation. And we had people working together with respect to changing voting patterns, including people for the elections in Congress. We saw great changes. We moved from like 3% or 4% of the population in the Congress, at least the House of Representatives, to a little bit more than 10% during that period of time. Now, where we are, there are forces that would deny us the right to vote. People who have say they are entitled and we aren't. To me, that's a form of violence. If you say that your children, and you have great wealth, are entitled because of your wealth and their heritage, and the accident of their children's birth, that they are more entitled than my children who have nothing physically or economically, then what you're saying basically is that some people are inherited better than others. And it goes back to where we began. Black people are inherently inferior. That's what our Constitution said. So where we are now is this. We have a challenge to look at 1956 and 57 and to see what it was these people faced and see how that relates to this year and see how it will relate to next year. we do know this. There are no forces in the South anymore, outside Virginia perhaps. One or two other little bastions of decency where black people and brown people can have the right to vote on equal terms. You're taking people from this country who are brown, and as one of the speakers said yesterday, making them show identification. But other people don't have to show it. You're causing them to live in fear. Or what you're doing is you're increasing the number of people who live in fear, because little is known, we as black people have lived in fear most of our lives. When I came to Little Rock, you all may not remember this, black policemen could not arrest white people in black neighborhoods. They had to call a white person, policeman, to come and effectuate the arrest. Some towns in the state of Arkansas would not let black people walk on sidewalks if white people were on those sidewalks. I mean, those are examples of power addressed to reinforcing the notion of racial inferiority and racial superiority. Now, fortunately, we have had people go through fire. They did it for our benefit. We were grateful, and we tried to reciprocate by doing the things that we did in order to let it be known that their work was not in vain. So I want to applaud them again and remind you too. Applaud them for what they did and what they continue to do. They write about their work and what they did. But they have all, except one, had to leave Little Rock, Arkansas in order to find their future. And the one who stays has been treated horribly, just horribly, by an establishment that says it is grateful. What is that other than violence? And it's deliberate violence, and I hope you don't mind me missing it. But in this city of Little Rock, they dishonored Elizabeth by even shooting her son in his yard for no reason. So that means that it doesn't matter who you are, or what you've done, or your contribution to society. We are all still in that boat. And violence surrounds us. But your example is still before us. And by this crowd, which I see as mixed, pretty much half and half, it is an example of what happened in the 60s. Can it be continued? And to what end? But I think now that we see that the oppression basically comes from those who are at the top of the wealth chain. And it is important for us to remember that as we try to build America so as to be inclusive for everybody without there being wealth gaps. And I think that when we can do that, we'll be able to, in effect, point back to 1957 and 1958. Remember now, they not only went to school in 57 and got out for 1 year in 58, the schools were closed. They had to leave town in order to get an education, separated from their families. That's violence. That is. But remember, we all pay prices. And the prices are still before us, because the enemy is more formidable now than it was then, as it is now constituted nationally and stands to be internationally unless there are some changes made. The Little Rock Nine were up to the task in 1957. I ask you, are we up to the task in 2000? What year is this? 19. It'll be 2020 soon. Let us remember what they did as we go through the next few months. And after we review and listen to what they have to say when I finish. I want to thank them because they gave me an opportunity, even though I didn't plan to come back here, came back here to try to finish the task that they started. So I've been on this school case in Little Rock for 50 years. And throughout those years, we've been trying to see to it that black poor children, and poor children in general, had a fair opportunity to get an education. And wherever we go, we find people saying, the time is not right. It is not here. Wait your time. Well, they didn't wait their time. They were thrust into it in a way. But we can't wait. You can't wait. America can't wait. Thank you.